So let's talk about Israel, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the many other groups that are involved. So I'm going to disagree with almost all of the commentators on YouTube and the news media. And this video is probably going to make a lot of people upset. But this is the facts. This is a tactical situation. And this is my thoughts on what happened, how, and why. So the first thing we have to understand is this was not unexpected. When it would happen and where it would happen is what was unexpected, not the actual tactics, methodology, and the size of the attack. Those were all pretty much a given thing. I've done over 500 videos here on YouTube, and basically that is an instructional course on how to avoid things like this. And the reason is this is a universal tactic that's used by Islamic forces. It's also used by a lot of other forces around the world. And a long time ago, I did a study on Islamic forces, Islamic law, the hows and whys they fight, the rules they fight under, and most importantly, the fact that anything taken in battle by an Islamic army is their property, whether it's people, children, military prisoners, goods, land, so on and so forth. So the first thing you have to understand is Israel is dealing with multiple Islamic armies. The attack that came from Gaza was an Islamic army, not some little terrorist group. The second thing is, in the Middle East, you have secular Arab armies and you have Islamic Arab armies. The way they operate, the rules they operate under are totally different. You have to understand the enemy. Now, when you look at the immigration into the United States and Europe, a lot of this Islamic army has been moved into these countries. So as this war builds, there's a very distinct possibility that these people that were embedded in the refugees will become active. So not all, and maybe most of the refugees were not part of the Islamic army. But it's kind of like the refugees and illegal aliens coming over the border. There's a lot of military people mixed in with them and a lot of smugglers mixed in with them that use them for cover. So when we look at the tactics, the kidnapping of women and children, the taking of prisoners, that's part of the standard process that an Islamic-based army works under. This is used for several purposes. One is negotiation. One is to create a fear of terrorism. The other is as a financial operation to fund their operations or to make individual leaders rich. So when you look at the slave trade that occurred way back, Western nations such as the United States, Europe, and England only received about 25% of the slaves that were traded out of Africa. The other 3/4 actually went to Muslim nations. And the reason that you do not have large populations of African origin in these Muslim countries is they castrated all the male slaves. Now, in a lot of cases, for instance, in Lebanon, when I was in high school, I went to high school with the son of a general in the Christian Phalange in Lebanon back when Lebanon was majority Christian. Basically, the Christians were pushed out and the Islamic factions won the war in Lebanon. And you had the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the basis of most of these groups we have today, was situated in Lebanon. The problem was when Israel invaded Lebanon and pushed this group out, basically they had a truce and they were allowed to go anywhere in the world. So you actually spread the problem all over the world and you created a network. So the PLO became what we have today over the last 50 years. So when we talk about the methodology used on the Islamic side, the tactics you saw, the raping, pillaging, the kidnapping of people, taking of prisoners and taking them back, the parading of bodies around, this is all part of the standard motif, standard operating procedure. Now, what people miss sight of, the tactics were not unknown. Going all the way back to Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, parasails, hang gliders, all that was used all the way from then till now to get over border walls, fences, and fortifications by PLO and other Islamic groups. If you look at Israel recently, going back to the last 20 years, a lot of raids into Israel were conducted that way on a small scale. Now, the fact that you had 29 penetration points across the border and they were done by mechanical means, bulldozers, backhoes, front-end loaders, explosives, wire cutters, bolt cutters, that is normal guerrilla warfare. We've talked about that I don't know how many times on this channel. Now, the interesting thing is we also talked about not depending on electronic surveillance. That was one of the failures on the Israeli side. The other failure was the disbandment of local militia and keeping weapons at home in Israel. And as we talked on the crossbow video recently, I said everybody fights. So if you got AKs, you got M4s, if you got a muzzle loader, if you got the crossbow, the bow and arrow, you got a handgun, how many of the people in Israel would have survived if they'd have had any of that? Because what you had was a primitive infantry attack. So a primitive infantry attack is covered by the actual professional army. So the rocket fire, the drone activity, that was the professional army. Then you had spec ops, and you had just anybody they could find that came through on the ground. These people were supported by professional fire from a professional army, but most of the killing and stuff was done by these irregular troops. And as we talked about with the primitive infantry, it's patterned on the same thing that happened in Rwanda, where the general there bought 500,000 machetes, and that was the base of his army. So what he would do is pick penetration points into populated areas and push the troops through with the machetes, and they do the hacking. So the only surprising thing about what happened with Gaza and Israel is the fact that the leadership in Gaza didn't complete the operation. What is really surprising is they didn't get a whole bunch of old Moise Nagants, give them to 50 or 100,000 people and push them through all 29 penetration points. That's the only surprising thing about it. Now, the big problem that Israel had is they disbanded their militia system except for the kibbutz in some of the more rural areas. And I can remember when Israel sold off a huge amount of handguns and rifles and stuff like that that used to be part of their civil defense program. And you'll notice none of these people that lived adjacent to the enemy had any guns on them, did they? So the fact that in Israel, they pretty much have a secular society that's very liberal. So they have a lot of gun control, and they don't issue guns to the individuals to keep at home much anymore, like they used to do 50 years ago. So the liberalization of Israel and the movement toward a secular government has actually disarmed the population. So if you had a malicious system, you had defense in depth, you had improvised and expediently constructed defensive fortifications, ways to close roads near the border areas, then this would not have happened to the extent it did. So those are my thoughts. Please share yours. We'll see you on the next video.